The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
2ndCast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasting.
What made it almost unbearable was their conclusion that her husband's parents and brother had gone to the house and done nothing to help her. Someone had taken the time to try to wipe up the mess. Cops found a bucket and blood-smeared washcloths in the sink, but they had not picked up the phone. Fred, Joan, and Debbie were at a loss to explain how they could have watched her moaning in agony, the blood draining out of her, with no one dialing 911. If Jim Cahill had not gone for Dr. Kelly, Jill would have died on that kitchen floor. Dr. Kelly called himself. He saved her life. From While She Slept by Marion Collins. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is episode 162, Perennial Bloom, part 3 of my trilogy on While She Slept by Marion Collins. Quickly, because I want to get back to the case because I left you hanging, I want to thank Nerf Father, Court BOTD, and Hopper Daily for their gracious 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. And I greatly appreciate your effort of figuring out how to do that. So a heartfelt thank you. And announcement. I have something very special for you murder boogies. I am excited to announce a Michael Kors giveaway. And here's how it works. You write a review of Aphrodite Jones's new book, Dog of War. Upload your review to Amazon or Goodreads. Take a screenshot and visit her website at www.aphroditejones.com/contact-us. If you get to her page, the tab is under Contact and Giveaways. Now, upload the screenshot and fill out the form for a chance to win a stunning Michael Kors purse. You can find out all the details on my Patreon, and I've also posted about it on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The deadline for entries is Mother's Day, May 10th, 2026, so you have plenty of time. Do not miss out on this opportunity. This is just so much fun. Additionally, I will be releasing my interview with Aphrodite Jones about Dog of War shortly. My review on it is already available on Amazon and Goodreads and on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, April 2026. So good luck, murder boogies, and let me know who wins. All right, so now I'm going to do a very brief recap. April 21st, 1998, Jill Cahill was nearly beaten to death by her husband, Jeff Cahill. Arrested and released on bail, the search for justice takes a horrifying turn 6 months later in October 1998. Please be sure to listen to episode 159, part 1, and episode 161, part 2, before this conclusion, part 3. Now, today we find estranged husband, Jeff Cahill, has been taken into custody after someone snuck into the hospital where his wife, Jill, lay recovering from a serious brain trauma and poured potassium cyanide down her throat. Investigator David Longo received a call at home regarding this assault on Jill. Upon arriving at the station, he saw Jeff through the window. He was relaxed and defiant, requesting a lawyer and exercising his right to remain silent. He really believed that he was clever, the smartest guy in the room, and that he'd get away with this murder plot of his. At 5:12 a.m., Detective Chris DiGiorno sought a judge's approval for a search warrant of Jeff Cahill's residence, attached structures, and his Jeep. The warrant targeted several items, including wigs, hospital uniforms, toxic chemicals, and an ID card. DiGiorno's affidavit included statements from hospital employee John George, Marie Morley, and Justin Hamlin, all of whom identified Jeff Cahill from a photo lineup. Cynthia Jones and Tyrone Hunter also confirmed that he was the intruder they had seen. Additional search warrants would be processed as the investigation intensified. Key items included the black Jeep, clothing, capsules, vials or bottles, Jeff's computer and related items, maroon baseball cap, sunglasses, various packages, documents from Bryant Lab and Spectrum Quality Labs, and General Super Plating Company, handwritten notes by Jeff, any UPS documents, and anything related to cyanide. At the Cahill house, Officer Fred Bronny joined the team, and he noticed green glitter in a small plastic container, the top being exactly like the one found on Jill Cahill's bed. And in the dresser drawer, there were 4 wigs and pairs of sunglasses. At the McDonald house where the Russell family were staying, the phone rang at 10:30 p.m. Tom McDonald transferred the call to the guest cottage where Joan Russell was feeling unwell and was about to go to bed. The hospital then told her that someone had broken into the hospital and attacked Jill, as panic gripped everyone. Sirens then screamed into the driveway as the police arrived to escort them to the hospital. With the children, Tim and Mary, left with the McDonalds, everyone rushed out in response to the emergency. At the hospital, they were informed it was very grave, and they got no response from Jill's brainstem, as time ticked by agonizingly slow, waiting for additional information. When they were finally allowed to see Jill, the family saw that she was dead, sustained only by a respirator. Scratches on her chin and mouth made it clear that Jill had fought till the very end. Kathy McDonald called Jill's sister Debbie at 5:30 a.m., telling her that Jeff had entered Jill's room at the hospital and attacked her again. Although Jill was stable, Kathy urged Debbie to hurry. Debbie Yeager and her husband Bill quickly gathered their children and made their way to the hospital, joining several of Jill's friends in the waiting room. Debbie would share, quote, "They were still working on her, and I had no idea about the severity of it," end quote. Jill had managed to come back time and time again, so Debbie assumed that she'd snap out of it now, too. But then Michelle gently told her that Jill was on life support because she was brain dead. As all hope drained out of Debbie, a cold feeling washing through her body, top to bottom. They held vigil all day, hoping for a miracle, while the staff in hazmat suits tended Jill, as she was contaminated with a deadly substance. Tim and Mary were brought over so that they could say goodbye to their mom, as they struggled to hold back tears. Katie was heartbroken for little Mary, so sad, so vulnerable, praying for her mother. The priest arrived and administered last rites to Jill. When they took her off life support, Jillian Catherine Russell Cahill passed away at 6:45 p.m. on Wednesday, October 28, 1998. She was 41 years old. The day after Jill died, Jeff's brother Tim Cahill contacted the Russells. He had discovered that Jeff's truck was in his parking lot and that it was registered to Jill. He ordered them to, quote, "Get this goddamn truck out of here or I'll throw it out on the street," end quote. While Tim was behaving like a horse's ass, the medical examiner, Marion, was performing Jill's autopsy. It was determined that Jill had died from suffocation due to cyanide poisoning, confirming the death as a homicide. From Jeff's perspective, this wasn't supposed to happen. Gonna get science-y for a minute. According to the National Institute of Health, cyanide is rapidly metabolized and eliminated from the human body. Inhaled potassium cyanide, a salt, reacts with moisture, forming hydrogen cyanide, which is even more dangerous. The initial washout is nearly immediate. It just disappears. Research shows that the average half-life of inhaled cyanide is 16 seconds. That means the time it takes for the cyanide exhaled into the air to decrease by 50%. So after 1 minute of breathing clean air, it becomes indistinguishable from baseline levels. Now, funnish fact, it's not really a fun fact. Ingested cyanide lasts longer in the body. The elimination half-life is generally cited as 2 to 3 hours. And approximately 80% of absorbed cyanide is converted in the liver to thiocyanate, a much less toxic substance, which is then excreted into the urine. So let me explain Jeff's plan. He picked a poison that kills extremely fast and would virtually vanish just as quickly from the body if he had not been seen, if he had not been noticed, if staff hadn't gone into Jill's room immediately. She would have died with no one the wiser. And given how dire her injuries were and how fragile her health was, maybe there would have been an autopsy, but maybe not. Maybe the Russells had just had enough and would now be consumed with Jill resting in peace and with their grandchildren. And even if they did do an autopsy, cyanide isn't normally tested for, and even if they did, how much would have remained? Now, while cyanide is volatile and does rapidly metabolize, generally it can be detected within 24 to 48 hours post-mortem if it's ingested. Inhalation is a little different, as I explained. At 7:30 a.m., the search warrants were executed at Jeff and Jill's house. Patty, Jim, and Mark Cahill then arrived because Patty wanted to retrieve a shirt for her son who was cold in jail. She was told no one could enter the home and she should give her son one of her husband's shirts. But instead of leaving, they drove around to the backyard with an officer following, shouting that he had instructed for them to leave. Mark Cahill insisted that he wanted to get a piece of equipment, a brake that was located by the shed, and the officer lost patience, replying, quote, "What part of get out of here don't you understand?" End quote. Reporting this conversation to his boss, Sergeant Don Hilton, Detective Mark Abraham, and Gordon Keonce arrived to execute the warrant on the grounds and the shed, especially the shed, given Mark Cahill's interest in it. Moving a lawnmower, the shed was propped up on cinder blocks with gaps between them. Behind the shed were sawhorses and tools covered by a blue tarp, along with the brake that Mark Cahill was wanting. Shifting some debris-covered bricks, they found a blue and white bottle of potassium cyanide, labeled Spectrum Quality Company. Jeff's secret stash of deadly cyanide was found, which was quite damning. And I have to wonder, what was Mark Cahill actually trying to retrieve? The brake? Or something else stashed back there? What do you think, murder bookies? Meanwhile, Detective Stephen Stonecipher was interviewing UPS driver Bob Leo, who filled him in on the intercepted packages that had been sent to General Super Plating. Now Stonecipher interviewed Kevin Keenan, the shipping clerk, who led him to Cynthia Breno and Tracy Jones. Jones said she had spoken to the DeWitt police about the fraud and the cyanide. And by Halloween, evidence was accumulating. A partly burnt wig, a pair of rubber gloves, a maroon baseball cap, sunglasses, and a multitude of documents from Bryant Labs, Spectrum Quality Labs, and general superplating ordering cyanide were found. Jill's funeral was held on October 31st, 1998. Tom Tulloch sat right behind the Russells, and Debbie and Bill, accompanied by his entire extended family. Many tears were shed, but there were also smiles as people remember how Jill lived life at full tilt, embracing fun, love, and joy. A friend of hers, Nancy Radke, wrote a poem inspired by Jill's life, which was published in the Post-Standard on November 1st. Wildflowers are nothing but weeds made beautiful by your care. Dug from gullies and fields, you move and tame them, water them with your tears. Their wilted leaves refreshed, they spring perennial year after year. But what of you in their beauty basking? Such sorrows deep within, you pluck your courage from the blossoms. Tender children, loving family, faithful friends, a bouquet made beautiful with your care. Perennial is your bloom that never fades in the garden of our hearts. I can see why there were both tears and smiles. Cremated, Jill's urn would reside at the Russell family residence, keeping Jill close to her loved ones. On that same day, family court judge Anthony Paris prohibited Jeff, his parents, brothers, and extended family from having any contact or interactions with Tim and Mary Cahill, as well as Joan and Fred Russell, for any reason. Another hearing was scheduled to assess whether the children required a protective order against their father's family, considering the homicide and the multiple violations of the previous court orders. Joan and Fred Russell would be granted sole custody of their grandchildren and would begin to make plans to return home to Tonawanda, simply devastated. The uproar from the community was intense. People were outraged that Jeff had apparently walked into a hospital with a bogus ID and murdered his wife. The outcry grew louder when an employee admitted that she had seen Jeff in the hospital before. Administrators offered weak excuses, but nothing could reasonably explain how Jeff Cahill, whose mugshot was widely known and placed at the nurses' stations, went unchallenged through the hospital, while Joan, Fred, and Debbie were regularly asked to show their IDs. It was maddening, and it got worse when a journalist from the Post-Standard reported on the DeWitt police's, quote, failure to connect the dots in their lackluster investigation, end quote, that someone fraudulently and illegally acquired cyanide and was out there somewhere, it ultimately being used to kill Jill Cahill. An investigation would conclude that General Superplating had acted appropriately by notifying the police when they discovered the cyanide was missing. However, neither DA Rick Trunfio nor Bill Fitzpatrick was aware of the missing poison until after Jill Cahill was murdered. Cleaning out Jill and Jeff's home was a difficult task for Jill's family and friends. Jill had transformed the rundown farmhouse into a beautiful space, but it now felt cold and lifeless. From behind the back of a picture, a piece of cardboard with a message written in Jeff's handwriting was found. Quote, weird sexual innuendo, homosexual stuff about gerbils, just sick, end quote. Well, what the hell? Michelle said that Jill had found the note last winter and had deeply wondered what was going on. Now, for the record, I do not care what your sexual orientation is. It is none of my business. People gotta be people and love who you love. But abusing animals is absolutely not okay. Okay. Well, then the news came out that the grand jury had indicted Jeff on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree murder, and 3 other serious charges, with him being arraigned the next morning.
Jeff would plead not guilty to all 7 charges, and District Attorney Bill Fitzpatrick planned to seek the death penalty. Now, this whole thing sounds very straightforward, like premeditated first-degree homicide, right? But not quite. So, a little bit of background. In March 1995, so 3 years before Jill's death, Governor George Pataki had signed a new capital punishment bill into law after an 18-year hiatus. At this time in New York State, a death sentence could be imposed for intentional murders that occurred during rape, robbery, or kidnapping, for contract killings, for the murder of law enforcement officials, or for murders involving torture. Executions would be carried out by lethal injection. After a guilty verdict is reached, the jury decides whether to impose the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole during the penalty phase.
They must consider mitigating factors such as the defendant's lack of criminal record or mental incapacity, alongside aggravating factors like prior violent convictions or terrorist-related crimes. A unanimous verdict is required for either sentence. If the jury cannot reach a unanimous decision, the defendant receives a life sentence with a minimum of 20 years. January 1999. Defense motions after defense motions were filed trying to derail the prosecution's case. They attempted to separate the assault and the murder charges, but lost. They claimed the death penalty was sought to appease the Russells, and because Jill was a white middle-class victim. And there was no reason for Jeff to kill his wife since she was in a coma and unable to testify. Judge Burke upheld the death penalty and the validity of the search warrants. In April 1999, the Russells filed a $40 million wrongful death suit against Jeff and Doyle Security, the company that provided the security at University Hospital. In 2005, the New York Court of Claims dismissed the negligence claims against the state, which operated the hospital. The court ruled that the hospital had no reason to anticipate such a, quote, bizarre and extraordinary criminal act, end quote, as Jill Cahill had used an elaborate disguise to bypass security. So a month later, in May 1999, jury summonses were sent out to over 1,000 citizens of Onondaga County, with 565 individuals arriving at the Civic Center on May 26th. They were given a 30-page questionnaire to assess their views on the death penalty, specifically whether they were for it or against it. 2 weeks later, 290 potential jurors returned. Then, on June 17th, defense attorney Richard Priest contacted DA Fitzpatrick, informing him that Jeff was willing to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence without parole. Considering this, Fitzpatrick outlined 5 conditions for the plea deal. Jeff had to admit battering Jill, that he forced cyanide down her throat, that he would relinquish all parental rights, that he would place $100,000 in trust for the children, and he would cooperate with any civil lawsuits brought by his in-laws. Priest found the offer appealing, but Jeff did not have access to $100,000. I mean, he was broke. Fitzpatrick subsequently withdrew the offer, prompting Priest to file a motion claiming bad faith and requesting that Fitzpatrick be removed from the case. Fitzpatrick now dropped the financial demand, but now Jeff was unwilling to admit attempting to kill Jill to prevent her from testifying, and Fitzpatrick was not pleased with this development. In July, Priest appealed to the New York State Supreme Court, requesting that the trial be moved out of Onondaga County due to concerns that pre-trial publicity had tainted the jury pool. Despite this concern, the court decided to proceed, and the trial was scheduled to begin on August 2nd. 3 days before the trial was set, Priest sent a letter to the DA in which Jeff claimed responsibility for the first-degree assault and the first-degree murder. However, he would not admit to killing Jill to prevent her testimony. Fitzpatrick rejected the plea. I don't understand why this is such a sticking point for Jeff,
What was he afraid of? What was he hiding? The jury was impaneled at 9:30 a.m., comprising 7 men and 5 women with 6 alternates. Jill's brother Dave felt a strong urge to strangle Jeff upon seeing him, but he restrained himself and did not. Bill Fitzpatrick opened by summarizing Jill and Jeff Cahill's relationship, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He detailed the brutal beating that almost killed Jill on April 21, 1998, and named the witnesses present that night. Over the next 6 months, Jill fought to survive in the hospital for her children, while Jeff, out on bail, sought cyanide to kill her. After a relapse in August, Jeff postponed his actions, waiting to see if she would die. By October, Jill was in the rehab unit and was growing stronger, and her mother-in-law finally visited, witnessing her physical and verbal recovery. This news reached Jeff, prompting him to disguise himself and sneak into the hospital, where he delivered the poison directly into Jill's mouth. Defense attorney Gary Mile acknowledged that Jeff assaulted Jill with a baseball bat, aiming to weaken the state's capital case against him. He argued that Jeff, who loves his family and God, is not a cold-blooded monster. The prosecution claimed that Jeff entered the hospital to commit burglary and then murder Jill. However, back in April, Jeff admitted to hitting Jill, stating that she pulled a knife on him, causing him to snap. He also revealed suicidal thoughts, indicating his mental state was fragile. And despite all this, Jeff now insisted that he did not kill Jill. The prosecution's witnesses included Jill's divorce attorney, Anthony DiCaprio, and New York State Trooper Tom Hauptman, who responded to the 911 call and saw the horrific carnage of the brutal attack on Jill. During the trial, photographs showing the blood spatter throughout the downstairs area were presented, causing jurors to gasp as the crime scene technician explained the sequence of events. Dr. John Kelly testified that he had not administered any care to Jeff, who had sustained some cuts. But Jill, with her skull bashed in, Dr. Kelly knew she had to get upstate for surgery immediately. There was nothing he could do for her at the scene. Kelly was clearly still disturbed by the Cahill family's callousness that night. Rick Tromfio now called Trooper Richard Dix, who had seen Jeff at Community Hospital, discussing his statements and injuries. Investigator Maynard Cosnett also shared Jeff's recorded statements, which conflicted with the crime scene evidence. Detective David Longo noted his suspicions about Jeff's injuries, which Jeff finally admitted to inflicting on himself. Day 2 of the trial examined how Jeff acquired cyanide through numerous internet searches for deadly poisons, how he ordered the cyanide from General Super Plating, a company in nearby DeWitt, via Bryant Labs. UPS driver Robert Leo testified that a man driving a black Wrangler repeatedly was looking for packages, which raised his suspicions. Leo reported this to Kevin Keenan, who noted the Jeep's license plate and informed GSP employee Tracy Jones. Tracy Jones testified that she received unordered deliveries of potassium cyanide with fake company logos and misspelled names. When a package containing potassium cyanide went missing, it couldn't be found, with some guy showing up looking for packages, she called the DeWitt Police Department. She recalled this incident on October 29th after hearing about Jill Cahill's murder by cyanide and immediately contacted the police suspecting a connection. Investigator Joseph Donahue of the Computer Crimes Unit in Albany conducted the forensic analysis of Jeff Cahill's computer. He had spelled Tracy with an E, and he ordered the potassium cyanide on July 10, 1998, sending the shipment to Miss Jones. Chief Assistant District Attorney Glenn Sotheby from Oronoga County testified about seeing Jill Cahill's physical condition that night in April and thought he was looking at a homicide. He stated that her ability to testify in Jeff Cahill's assault trial would have depended on her medical condition and the doctor's advice,
But yes, they intended to call Jill to testify. Defense attorney Gary Miles then asked why law enforcement didn't know what Jill Cahill remembered from the night of the assault. Sotheby replied that the DA was keeping abreast of the situation and when it would be appropriate to speak to her about it. Quote, "Wasn't it a fact that based on what you folks know, Jill Cahill had no recollection of the assault whatsoever?" "That is not true, sir," said Sotheby. "Was Jill struggling to remember her children's names on October 27th? Was it really necessary to wheel Jill into court? There were already plenty of medical records and photographs." Well, Sotheby testified that having the victim present in court was always beneficial for the jury, end quote. Next sworn in was Dr. Gerald Rodzowicz, who testified that Jill Cahill arrived in critical condition, needing 10 pints of blood. He detailed her recovery progress over 6 months in rehabilitation, where she seemed likely to regain a meaningful life. Sadly, she then became brain dead and was kept alive by a respirator. Dr. Mary Umbelik, the medical examiner, testified that when assaulted, Jill had sustained at least 4 blows to her head, along with numerous contusions and bruising across her body. The night she was murdered, Jill had suffocated, and the scratches on her chin and lips were not consistent with medical attempts to save her. Jill's death resulted from oxygen deprivation due to cyanide poisoning, combined with the blunt force trauma. Now Dr. Stephen Laduska discussed her recovery progress and was followed by Fred Russell, who had watched his daughter struggle for 6 months. By October, she was showing some improvement. And now Joan, Michelle, and Zany were all crying right along with the jurors. Jeff was stoic and completely disengaged, even from his own attorneys. On August 5, 1999, Patty Cahill testified. She admitted that after her visit with Jill, she noted Jill's physical improvement. Quote, "And he expressed concern as to whether or not she was going to tell the truth. Is that right? When I was telling Jeff about Jill, he said nothing," end quote. Patty was now asked to reread her grand jury testimony to clarify her statement. And by the time she left the witness stand, the jury understood that Jill could speak, and Jeff was afraid of what she might say. The next day, 5 hospital employees were sworn in to testify about seeing Jeff Cahill disguised as a janitor with a mop on the night Jill was poisoned with cyanide. 2 weeks before Jill's murder, nurse Donna Holloway encountered him in Jill's room and confronted him, prompting Jeff to flee. Forensic scientist Tamara Denner testified that she had examined the sheets from Jill's bed, noting a strong odor that led her to place them in the lab's chemical hood to eliminate any toxic fumes. The bottle cap found on Jill's bedside matched those of the bottles of glitter discovered in Jeff Cahill's house. Dr. Timothy Roenick, director of forensic toxicology, testified that the substance found on Jill's neck, hospital gown, and sheets was potassium cyanide. A blood sample taken in the emergency room showed 15 micrograms of cyanide per milliliter, with 1 microgram considered fatal. District Attorney Trumpfio would explain, quote, "If Jill had lain undisturbed all night, any trace of cyanide would have been lost. I think he was looking for something incredibly lethal, quick, because he realized he was going to be poisoning her in a hospital. So if he used something slower, she might have been brought around," end quote. Now the defense requested to have the charges dismissed, but Judge Burke denied the motion. Gary Miles then called his only witness, Dr. William Scott Allen, a childhood friend of Jeff's and a family doctor in Skaneateles. Dr. Allen recounted a phone call from Jeff in early 1998, which led him to visit Jeff's home. During this visit, Jeff said his marriage was over and that he was stressed and worried about his children, who were with the Russells in Buffalo. He mentioned being under stress due to frequent arguments with Jill. On cross-examination, Dr. Allen revealed
he hadn't examined Jeff in over 2 years and could not recall if Jeff had mentioned a lack of intimacy with Jill for over 6 years. However, he confirmed that Jeff's main complaint had been lack of sleep. Dr. Allen learned that 3 days after his visit to Jeff's house, he had beaten his wife with a baseball bat. On redirect, Miles asked about Jill's infidelity. Allen said Jeff had discovered her affair from a phone bill, and Jeff claimed that Jill had become irrational, was drinking too much, and threatened suicide with a knife, saying, "If I stab myself, they'll think you did it." Fitzpatrick now asked if Cahill had used Allen to create a defense while planning to kill Jill, to which Allen responded that he had no way of knowing. After a brief recess, the defense rested. The question of why the defense didn't call Tom Tulloch to the stand circulated around the community. While it wouldn't have cleared Jeff of his violent actions, it might have provided some context. However, Miles and Priest decided against it. Bill Fitzpatrick reasoned that it would have been a tactical mistake, as probing into Jill's sex life would have opened the door to monkeying around in Jeff's, including condoms and makeup found in cubbyholes and references to gerbils written on cardboard, which could have been very damaging to the defense. Fitzpatrick said, quote, "Jill was a very beautiful woman, and the marriage was really precipitated by her pregnancy with Tim. We were never able to get this out in trial, but there were 2 things that related to my theory of what precipitated the murder. Jill had told her friends that after the birth of Mary, their sexual intimacy stopped. So that is a period of 8 years. Yet Jill had found the condoms." End quote. They had investigated deeply, but could not come up with anyone who claimed to be Jeff Cahill's lover. But Fitzpatrick was convinced that he was having homosexual trysts and could not face his mother finding out. Quote, "I don't think there would have been anything more devastating to the defendant's mother than a nasty divorce proceeding and for Jill to reveal that Jeff was gay. Patty would just have reacted very, very forcefully to that." End quote. And that possibly puts the condoms into some context. It is a reasoned speculation, but we just don't know. Closing arguments took place on August 10th, with the prosecution blowing the defense out of the water and leaving a strong impression on the jurors. While the defense admitted that Jeff had beaten Jill, they asserted that he did not kill her. And I have to wonder if some other lunatic that happened to resemble Jeff snuck into the hospital that night and killed Jill with cyanide. Right? No, that makes no sense. Now Judge Burke began to instruct the jury on the law. To convict someone of first-degree murder, the jury had to determine that he killed Jill during a burglary at University Hospital, where Jill currently resided. Regarding criminal possession of a weapon in the 4th degree, a person is guilty if they unlawfully obtained a dangerous instrument that can cause serious injury or death, in this case the potassium cyanide, with the intent to use it against another person. The judge emphasized that the jury must reach a unanimous decision, and with that, deliberations began, and this jury would be sequestered for the remainder of their time deliberating the case. With the jury absent, the defense now asked for a mistrial due to Mr. Fitzpatrick mentioning Patty Cahill's grand jury testimony. The judge denied the motion. Meanwhile, the Syracuse Post-Standard set up a hotline for updates on the emotionally charged trial. Less than 5 hours later, at 5:15 p.m., rumors of a verdict began circulating, and at 5:45 p.m., a very somber jury returned to the courtroom. Forewoman Mrs. Michelle Terry affirmed that they had a verdict in the People versus James F. Cahill. Assault in the 1st degree? Guilty. Next charge? Guilty. Murder in the 2nd, meaning that Jeff had killed Jill to silence her? Guilty. And it was guilty on all counts. Jeff Cahill stared ahead, never looking at anything but a distant wall. And Bill Fitzpatrick would say, quote, "I think there was an attitude that was there during the trial, that this nice, white, upper-middle-class, college-educated chap who was not going to get hard time. And then when it became a murder case, he certainly was not going to be sentenced to death," end quote. With the verdict in, Debbie burst into tears, falling against her husband, and Fred and Joan clutched each other. August 17th was set for the penalty phase of the trial. Jeff Cahill's death penalty trial was the first in Onondaga County since capital punishment was reinstated in 1995, so just 3 years before. The defense presented Judge Burke with 25 mitigating factors for why Jeff should be spared, highlighting his loyalty to his friends and coworkers, as well as his contribution to Tim's Little League. They argued that if sentenced to life without parole, Jeff could still have a positive impact on society. While in jail, Jeff was a model prisoner, tutoring others and seeking spiritual guidance. However, shortly after the verdict, he wrote to a jailhouse buddy, complaining about the lack of players for basketball and his inability to play cards or watch the Discovery Channel, expressing that prison life was no fun and he wasn't isolated from the usual prison indignities. It was all Dick Priest's fault. He should have let Jeff testify. The law was wrong, the jury and the prosecutors were all wrong, and, quote, "The good Lord will forgive his mistake because he was different from the rest of the scum behind bars," end quote. Jeff anticipated being sent to the state penitentiary, where he would have access to a radio, books, magazines, and the prison store. If he stayed out of trouble for 69 days, he would be allowed to watch TV with 12 channels and could visit with his family once a week. However, he knew the once-a-month showers and the strip searches would suck. And, quote, he boasted that he spent his days thinking up stinging barbs to sling at 4 prison guards he loathed. And in an unconscionable show of chutzpah, he devised the perfect excuse to justify stuffing poison down his wife's throat. It was a mercy killing, end quote. He had put her out of her misery. He was being punished for doing the right thing, and he'd be out in 15 to 20 years. Although, during the penalty phase, no one was privy to Jeff writing this. Several character witnesses testified on Jeff's behalf, including his younger brother John, who brought his wife and 7 children to court. John spoke about their mother as the family's backbone and highlighted the importance of redemption and forgiveness after Jeff's mistakes. Other family members, past customers, and former college roommates also shared positive remarks about Jeff. And the Russells listened quietly as the witnesses praised him, their stomachs rolling. Afterward, the defense rested its case. Bill Fitzpatrick now rose and asked the jury to sentence James F. Cahill to death by lethal injection because, quote, "the aggravating factors of this dastardly murder so far outweigh the mitigating factors. If the death penalty is not appropriate in this case, my God, when? This was a calculated, premeditated killing of a helpless woman," end quote. Death was the appropriate and just sentence. Judge Burke began his summation by reading all the mitigating factors and instructing the jurors how to apply the law. Quote, "You alone are responsible for deciding whether this defendant will spend the rest of his life in prison or that he'll be executed. Such a sentence must be unanimous," end quote. If they couldn't agree, the law required the judge to impose a sentence with the maximum term of life and a minimum of 20 to 25 years. August 19th at 3:30 p.m. deliberations began, and the jury would be sequestered. Their first vote at 7 p.m. resulted in a count of 10-2 in favor of the death penalty. The decision weighed heavily on the jurors, and the tension in the room was palatable. And shortly afterward, they notified the judge that one juror had fainted. Paramedics arrived quickly with the forewoman Michelle Terry complaining of chest pains. She spent the night in the hospital, with court deputies standing guard to ensure that nothing about the case was discussed. Attorneys Priest and Miles immediately called for a mistrial, but Judge Burke denied the request. While the jury remained at the hotel, the defense argued that an alternative juror should be seated. While uncertain, the judge decided to visit Mrs. Terry at the hospital to assess her condition himself. Upon return, Judge Burke reported that he had spoken with her and her doctors and confirmed that she was in A1 shape and the deliberations would resume shortly. At 11:30 a.m., Michelle Terry returned to the jury room. When they voted at noon, the count was 11-1, with Mrs. Terry the lone holdout. The other jurors assured her that no one would pressure her, and they all agreed to review the case again. Reflecting on the spirited fight of Jill to recover and be with her children, when they ultimately voted again at 12:30 p.m., Michelle Terry wrote death on her ballot. At 12:37 p.m., jurors entered the courtroom, with Mrs. Terry handing the verdict sheet to the court. When asked what the verdict was, she replied, "Death." Joan Russell gasped loudly and burst into tears, while Debbie began to sob, and Fred simply looked stunned. Jeff stared straight ahead, though a witness noticed his shirt rising and falling as his heart raced, and his family remained silent and grim. The verdict was confirmed to be unanimous, and the jurors were thanked for their difficult service. Outside the courtroom, the Russells met with jurors who had delivered justice for their daughter. Jeff Cahill had taken a life, and for that he would forfeit his own. Immediately, Richard Priest sought to have the death sentence overturned, citing the hospitalization that had interrupted deliberations. However, Judge Burke refused his request. He sentenced Jeff to 12.5 to 25 years for the assault, 2 years for the weapons charges, and signed the warrant for his execution. However, years of court appeals and hearings loomed for the future. Regarding her experience on the jury, Michelle Terry noted that the image of an injured Jill begging her kids to call 911 convinced her and her fellow jurors that they were correct in their assessment. She also felt that their decision sent a message to other perpetrators of violent abuse. They would be held accountable. Debbie Yeager, on the other hand, was simply shocked. She had expected a life sentence without parole, and she wondered how the children would cope with the fact that their father had murdered their mother and now faced execution. The sentencing phase took place on October 5th, and Debbie was able to ask Jeff what he believed he gained by killing Jill. He had tarnished the Cahill name forever, and she questioned how his actions would affect Tim and Mary, who also bore that name. She highlighted the damage he had caused his entire family, his parents, brothers, uncles, niece, and nephews. And as difficult as the trial had been, Jill's family had learned as much as they could about what happened to her. Quote, "We have never seen such a total disregard for human life as those early hours of April 21st. To leave Jill, the mother of your children, a daughter-in-law, a sister-in-law, lying on the floor bleeding to death, that no one called for an ambulance is absolutely despicable. On that morning, where were those Christian beliefs that we've heard such righteous testimony to?" End quote. Debbie now understood that Jill had hidden her pain for so long. She had felt so guilty for hurting Jeff, but was unable to cope with the deep unhappiness any longer. She wanted a stable future for her family. She ignored the advice to get out of the house, as she truly believed Jeff would never hurt her because he loved the kids so much. She was blind to the depth of Jeff's evil. Debbie and Bill vowed to take care of the two confused, angry, hurting children they swore to help them cope. They were healing, they were laughing and smiling again, and being loved by their family. Jeff was taken to the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, housed in the unit for condemned persons. He left behind his former luxury for a cell with a toilet, a sink, a bed, and a stainless steel shower stall, but no air conditioning or fans. The lights were on 24/7 and monitored by cameras and microphones. Meals were delivered through a slot in the door, and there were no packages allowed and no job opportunities, so there was no commissary access. Phone calls to family or religious advisors lasted 10 minutes and were made using prison cell phones dialed for the condemned man. Visits were conducted through thick sheets of plexiglass, which required yelling to communicate. Exercise was limited to a dog run. But it wasn't over. The Cahill case ignited a fierce debate over the death penalty in New York, following Governor Pataki's campaign promise to restore it, which he had done. Many argued that execution represented vengeance rather than justice. Editorials were widely published, and advocates for victims' rights used Jill as a symbol of the need for a strong death penalty, linking it to the fight against domestic violence. In contrast, religious leaders opposed the death penalty on moral grounds, while civil liberty groups highlighted concerns about fairness and the associated racial and economic disparities. The defense appealed, arguing that New York's death penalty was unconstitutional and that Jeff's emotional instability had prevented rational thought. They claimed the jury instructions were flawed, media coverage tainted the jury pool, and the circumstantial evidence regarding the cyanide was insufficient. And the prosecution had no direct witnesses, no video evidence or physical proof linking Jeff Cahill to the cyanide administration. In response, the prosecution argued that the circumstantial evidence was compelling. Jill was alive and stable until Jeff's visit, and her poisoning occurred immediately afterwards. They maintained that motive, opportunity, and forensic evidence were adequate for conviction. On November 15, 2003, the New York Court of Appeals found that Judge Burke made errors during the trial. During voir dire, he did not dismiss juror number 23, who admitted his history of domestic violence would make it hard for him to consider any penalty other than death. Conversely, a juror who had reservations about the death penalty but claimed he could be impartial was dismissed. Further, the prosecution charged Jeff Cahill with first-degree murder, alleging that he killed his wife to prevent her from testifying about a previous assault. However, the Court of Appeals ruled against this charge, stating that the evidence was insufficient to prove that witness elimination was a substantial reason for the murder. While I do believe he committed the murder to keep Jill silenced, I can understand how proving this motive beyond a reasonable doubt was challenging. Now, the Court of Appeals suggested that his primary motive was likely related to the destruction of his marriage and family life rather than a calculated attempt to silence a witness. The prosecution also argued that Cahill committed first-degree murder because the killing occurred during a burglary, as he entered the hospital room illegally with the intent to kill. However, the court rejected this argument, ruling that since his only intent for entering the room was the murder itself, the act did not meet the legal requirements for a burglary-linked capital offense. As a result, the Court of Appeals vacated the death sentence and reduced his conviction to second-degree murder. Jeff Cahill was resentenced to 37.5 years in prison. And I admit I was disappointed by the outcome, because I agree with DA Bill Fitzpatrick. If this kind of premeditation isn't a case for the death penalty, then which one is? The New York Times reported that juror Tina LaFontaine felt, quote, betrayed, end quote, when the death sentence was overturned. the law must maintain strict guidelines regarding the death penalty. It can't be loosey-goosey, so I understand the court's decision even if I dislike it. And why must premeditated murder be linked to another capital crime in the first place? Isn't premeditated murder bad enough standing alone? I don't know. Can someone explain this to me? Oh, and we're still not done. Jeff Cahill's successful appeal brought about significant changes. It was a precursor to New York's landmark ruling, the People v. LaValle, in June 2004, which declared the state's entire death penalty statute unconstitutional. And this ruling remains in effect today. In 2007, Jeff Cahill's lawyers sought to have his sentences for each charge served concurrently instead of consecutively. And if successful, this would have made him eligible for parole as early as October 2024. However, the appeals court rejected this request, and as of 2026, Cahill is now eligible for parole in April of 2036, when he will be 75 years old. But we're not done. There's more. There is an ongoing debate in New York State about the elder parole bill, Senate Bill S-454 and Assembly Bill A-514 for the 2025-2026 season, which means right now. This bill proposes that incarcerated individuals age 55 years or older who have served at least 15 years of their sentence would be eligible for a parole hearing. For example, Jeff Cahill meets the criteria, would be eligible for parole 10 years earlier than his scheduled release in 2036. Supporters clarify that the bill only allows for a hearing, not an automatic release, and that the parole board would retain discretion to deny parole based on factors such as crime severity and public safety risks. Advocates like the City Bar of New York argue that older inmates pose a lower risk of recidivism and that the state could save significant health care costs by addressing the needs of aging prisoners. And in March 2026, this bill won the support of the majority of the New York State senators. Stay tuned. District Attorney William Fitzpatrick, who is still in office, has described this proposal as insane. He specifically pointed to the Cahill case as an example of a, quote, notorious murderer, end quote, who should never be released. This proposal would also impact serial killers, such as David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, and Joel Rifkin, among others. See, I believe that life without the possibility of parole means life without the possibility of parole. I respect jury verdicts and the work that they do, and that is how our legal system operates. Releasing violent murderers solely because their health care costs increase as they age is misguided. And if released, these parolees would likely rely on government assistance and Medicaid, which are tax dollars anyway, plus the additional security concerns on communities that they're choosing to live in. And 55 is not elder. It's middle-aged. So I'm sorry, this is an incredibly stupid idea, and it's disrespecting the families and the victims. Now, according to Syracuse.com, Jill's sister, Deborah Yeager, has been a vocal opponent of the bill, arguing that it disregards crime victims and would force families to relive their trauma through frequent parole hearings. Furthermore, she intends to fight against it, quote, to make sure that he doesn't get out, end quote, when Jeff Cahill does become eligible, whether it's in 2026 or 2036. Her family would, quote, drag themselves up there if we have to attend any parole hearing for Jeff Cahill, regardless of the immeasurable emotional toll, end quote. Now, over the last 20 years, Deborah Yeager has been a passionate advocate for domestic violence victims. She has collaborated with District Attorney William Fitzpatrick to champion Jilly's Law, which was later incorporated into other legislation that was signed into law, and Deborah believes this could have saved Jill's life. Throughout her career, she has dedicated herself to helping other domestic abuse victims by advising families on what to expect during trials, and established Jilly's Room at a family justice center, creating a safe space for victims. So we saw that Jeff was granted bail the day after he assaulted Jill with the baseball bat, which I found outrageous. Previously, New York judges could only consider whether the defendant was a flight risk when setting bail. But now, under the new law, judges can take into account the safety of the victim and the community for domestic violence-related crimes. Key factors to consider include the defendant's history of violence or threats against the victim, the existence of or violation of protective orders, and the impact of the crime on the victim or witnesses. Additionally, there are stricter penalties for repeat offenders, with certain actions classified as felonies if the person has a prior conviction within the last 5 years. Moreover, the New York State Attorney General prohibits discrimination against individuals who are victims of domestic violence. And I am glad that these reforms were enacted. They are quite a legacy for Jill Cahill. In October 2025, CYN Central reported Deborah Yeager saying, Jill was very outgoing. She was independent. She was fun. She was someone who was beautiful inside and out. And I know it's a cliche, but she really fit that bill. If you met her, you fell in love with her automatically, and she would do anything for anybody. Now, this is 2ndCast, so I'm going to continue my update. What of Tim and Mary? So over the years, Deborah Yeager has spoken about her niece and nephew. The counseling they eventually received helped them to cope and come to terms with their mother's death and their father's incarceration. Mary has kept in touch with her father, while Tim prefers to move forward and not dwell on the horrors of the past. They have grown into lovely adults, intelligent and caring. And as of 2023, Tim lives near Baltimore, New York, where he works for a medical group. Mary has earned her master's degree and is currently living in Oregon, working for an engineer support company. Fred Russell and Joan were married for 56 years. He passed away in 2013, Joan 10 years later in 2023. And that wraps up my trilogy on While She Slept by Marion Collins, supplemented with The Cyanide Killer by Gerald L. Merrill. My next book, departure from the usual true crime genre, but I believe it is critically important. The Caregiver's Game, Unraveling Financial Deceit in the Shadows of Dementia by Charles Wallace. Our boomer population is aging, parents are aging, and the number of new dementia cases in the U.S. is expected to double over the next 4 decades, from 514,000 in 2020 to approximately 1 million by 2060. Families face difficult choices when their loved ones are afflicted with these diseases, and unfortunately, there are unscrupulous individuals poised to prey on their vulnerabilities and inflict elder abuse, often when the patients are unable to ask for help or comprehend what is happening. This book was written as a warning. It tells the story of Joelle Fleming, Charles Wallace's mother, who had her life's legacy stolen. It moved me deeply, and I wanted to highlight these issues to raise awareness. Not all caregivers are altruistic, nor are the attorneys. It is crucial to recognize that these crimes often go unnoticed until too late. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you joining me on this journey through some of the best true crime books. If you enjoy the podcast, please share it, leave a positive 5-star review. We have CRIMECON 2026 in Las Vegas coming up. Please come by Creators Row and see me and my assistant, my minion Michelle, who is such a great help to me. Our CRIMECON meetup is Thursday, May 28th, after the kickoff party in the lobby bar, the big one by the reception desk. Think 10 p.m. local time.
I can't wait to see you. And then I'll be on Creators Row with swag and stories, so let's take some photos. My sources, photographs, recipe, and drink information are on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, April 2026. You can contact me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or connect with me on X, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Additionally, you should join my Patreon for $2 to $4 a month and help me choose the next book I'll feature. And I'll be doing my serial killer case studies. My next episode will be out shortly. I see you as you hear me. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.